Sometimes the most extraordinary people hide in the most ordinary places. They pump your gas, serve your coffee, fix your car. You pass them every day without a second glance, never knowing that the person changing your oil might have once changed the course of history. This is the story of Marcus Tank Rodriguez, a man who traded his medals for mechanics tools, his uniform for grease-stained coveralls, and his brotherhood for silence. For 15 years, he lived quietly in a small Texas town, enduring mockery and dismissal from those who saw only what was on the surface. But some secrets are too big to stay buried forever, and some heroes are too valuable to remain hidden. What happened when Marcus's past collided with his present would remind an entire community that respect isn't earned by appearances, but by the courage to serve when it matters most. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Rodriguez Auto Repair, as Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his oil-stained hand. At 42, he moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that every action had consequences, every movement mattered. His weathered hands, scarred from years of working under car hoods, told stories that the people of Millfield, Texas would never think to ask about. "Hey, grease monkey!" The voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. Tommy Brennan stepped out of his pristine white pickup truck, his contractor's boots barely touching the ground before his mouth started running. "My truck's been making this weird noise. Think you can figure it out? Or should I take it to someone who actually knows what they're doing?" Marcus looked up from the engine bay of the Honda Civic he was working on. Mrs. Henderson's car needed a new alternator, and she was counting on him to keep the repair under $200 because that's all her Social Security check could spare this month. He'd already decided to eat the labor costs. "Morning, Tommy," Marcus said quietly, straightening up. "What kind of noise?" Tommy laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Like you'd understand if I told you. Just look at you, man. When's the last time you washed those clothes? Or took a shower that actually worked?" The other men standing around Tommy's truck chuckled. They were the same crew that showed up every Tuesday morning, killing time before their construction job started, using Marcus's shop as their personal entertainment venue. There was Jerry Walsh, who owned the hardware store and never missed a chance to remind everyone that he'd made something of himself. Next to him stood Dave Preston, the assistant bank manager who wore his title like a crown and his contempt like cologne. "You know what I heard?" Dave said, loud enough for Marcus to hear while pretending to whisper to the others. "I heard old Tank here never even finished high school. Just drifted into town one day with nothing but the clothes on his back and started calling himself a mechanic." The nickname Tank had followed Marcus from his old life, though none of these men knew its origin. They used it mockingly, thinking it referred to his stocky build, or maybe his slow, methodical way of speaking. They had no idea it was earned on a moonless night in Afghanistan, when he'd single-handedly taken out an enemy tank with nothing but determination and a rocket launcher that should have been impossible for one man to operate. Marcus said nothing. He'd learned long ago that defending himself only gave them more ammunition. Instead, he focused on the alternator in his hands, checking the connections with the same attention to detail that had once saved his team from an improvised explosive device hidden beneath a bridge outside Kandahar. "Look at him," Jerry continued. "Won't even stand up for himself. What kind of man just takes it like that?" The kind of man who knew that real strength wasn't measured in words, Marcus thought. The kind who understood that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was nothing at all. He'd seen too much violence, caused too much of it himself, to be provoked by the petty cruelty of small-town bullies. But as he worked, memories flickered through his mind like old film reels. The weight of his gear as his team prepared for their final mission. The way his commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, had looked at him when she handed in the Medal of Honor recommendation that he'd never stayed around to receive. The faces of the men who hadn't made it home. Good soldiers whose families would never know the full extent of their sacrifice because the mission was classified. And the men who could tell their stories had scattered to the winds. "Tommy, why don't you pop the hood and let me take a listen?" Marcus said, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his chest. "Oh, now he wants to pretend he's useful," Tommy said. But he pulled the hood release anyway. The engine revealed itself, and Marcus moved closer, his trained ear picking up the subtle irregularity and the rhythm immediately. It was the serpentine belt, probably a bearing going bad in one of the pulleys. 15-minute fix, $20 part. As he leaned over the engine bay, Tommy continued his running commentary. "You know what burns me up? Guys like Tank here, taking up space, contributing nothing. While real men are out there building this country, fighting for it, he's hiding in his little grease pit pretending to be useful." The irony was almost overwhelming. Marcus had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing or crying. He wasn't sure which. These men, who had never faced anything more dangerous than a paper cut, lecturing him about contribution and courage while he tried to diagnose their truck problems with hands that had once defused bombs and carried wounded comrades to safety. "Found your problem," Marcus said, pointing to the tensioner pulley. "Bearings going out. I can have it fixed in about 20 minutes. 20 minutes? Dave scoffed. "How do we know you won't screw something else up while you're in there?" "Jerry, didn't you tell me about that time you worked on your wife's car and it broke down again the next week?" "That's not what happened," Jerry said, but his voice carried less conviction than his usual bluster. "The transmission went out. That's got nothing to do with the oil change he did." Marcus remembered Mrs. Welsh's Buick clearly. He'd noticed signs that the transmission was failing when she brought it in, had even offered to take a look at it for free, but Jerry had dismissed him, saying he didn't want that loser touching anything else on the car. 2 weeks later, when the transmission failed completely, somehow it became Marcus's fault. "Look, just fix the truck," Tommy said, his tone suggesting he was doing Marcus some enormous favor. "But I'm not paying your full rate. Half price, take it or leave it." Marcus nodded. It wasn't worth arguing about. He'd learned that picking your battles was crucial for survival, whether you were navigating the social minefield of a small town or planning an extraction from enemy territory. Besides, he had bigger concerns than Tommy Brennan's opinion of his worth. As he worked on the truck, more of the Tuesday morning crowd gathered. They stood around drinking coffee from the gas station across the street, treating his shop like their personal theater. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, could hear the whispered jokes and casual cruelty. It was the same routine every week, and he endured it because this was his penance, his chosen exile from a world where his skills had been measured in lives taken rather than lives saved. "Hey, Tank," called out Mike Lawson, the youngest of the group at 28. "My cousin's getting married next month. You know any good caterers? Oh wait, you probably eat from gas station hot dog rollers, don't you?" The laughter that followed was sharp and mean, but Marcus had heard worse. He'd been called worse things by better men in situations that actually mattered. Still, there was something particularly exhausting about this casual, persistent cruelty. It wore on him in ways that enemy fire never had. He finished replacing the pulley and started the truck, listening as the engine settled into a smooth, quiet rhythm. "All set," he said, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Tommy climbed into the driver's seat and revved the engine a few times. The weird noise was completely gone, replaced by the purr of a well-maintained engine. He said grudgingly. "I guess you got lucky this time. Lucky." Marcus almost smiled at that. Luck was a sniper's bullet missing you by inches because you'd learned to trust your instincts about when to move. Luck was finding the one route through a minefield that intelligence had missed. Fixing a truck was just knowledge and experience, the kind that came from caring about your work and the people who depended on you. As the morning crowd dispersed, heading off to their various jobs and responsibilities, Marcus returned to Mrs. Henderson's Honda. The alternator installation was straightforward, but he took his time, double-checking every connection. She was counting on this car to get to her job at the elementary school, and the kids there were counting on her. It was a chain of responsibility that stretched through the community, invisible but vital. Around noon, as he was finishing up the Honda, a black sedan pulled into his lot. Marcus glanced up and felt his chest tighten. The car had government plates, and the two men who got out moved with the controlled awareness of federal agents or military personnel. One was tall and lean with graying hair, the other shorter but built like someone who still spent serious time in the gym. "Marcus Rodriguez?" the tall one asked. Marcus straightened up slowly, setting down his wrench. "That depends on who's asking." The shorter man reached into his jacket and pulled out a badge. "Agent Peterson, FBI. This is Agent Collins. We need to speak with you about a matter of national security." The words hit Marcus like ice water. For 15 years he'd been off the grid, officially discharged and forgotten. He'd chosen this life specifically because he wanted nothing more to do with the world of classified missions and necessary evils. Whatever they wanted, it couldn't be good. "I'm retired," he said simply. "We know," Agent Collins said. "We also know that retirement doesn't always stick when your country needs you." Mrs. Burt Henderson chose that moment to arrive for her car. She pulled up in her daughter's beat-up minivan, probably having taken time off work to pick up the Honda. Marcus saw her glance nervously at the federal agents, then at him. "Is everything all right, Marcus?" she asked, her voice carrying the concern of someone who had come to trust him over the years. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Henderson," he assured her. "Your car's ready. Runs like new." She smiled, the same grateful expression she wore every time he saved her money on repairs. "What do I owe you?" Just the parts, Marcus said as he always did. Labor's on the house. Marcus, you can't keep doing that, she protested, but she was already pulling $40 from her worn purse. Your time is worth something. Agent Peterson watched this exchange with interest, and Marcus could see him filing away details, drawing conclusions about the kind of man Marcus had become. It made him uncomfortable, being studied like a specimen under a microscope. After Mrs. Ebenezer, Henderson drove away in her smoothly running Honda. Agent Collins stepped forward. Mr. Rodriguez, we need to discuss a situation that's developed overseas. There's been a development in one of your old operations. I told you I'm retired. A Navy SEAL team has been captured in Syria. Agent Peterson said bluntly. The mission went sideways, and now 6 of America's finest are being held by a group that's making very specific demands. Marcus felt the familiar weight settling in his chest, the pressure that came with impossible choices and necessary sacrifices. What's that got to do with me? The mission they were on, Agent Collins said quietly, was based on intelligence you helped gather 15 years ago. The location, the target, the access routes. All of it traces back to Operation Desert Viper. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Operation Desert Viper had been his last mission, the one that had gone so far beyond what was supposed to happen that he'd warped away from everything afterward. He thought that nightmare was buried forever. That operation is classified, Marcus said. Was classified, Agent Peterson corrected. Someone leaked the details, and now they're being used against us. The SEALs walked into a trap that was 15 years in the making. Marcus looked around his shop, at the tools and equipment that represented his simple, honest life, at the calendar on the wall where he kept track of Mrs. Henderson's oil changes and Tommy Brennan's tire rotations, at the coffee cup he'd been drinking from that morning, now cold and forgotten. What exactly are you asking me to do? Agent Collins pulled out a tablet and showed him satellite footage of a compound in the Syrian desert. The hostage takers are demanding the location of something from Operation Desert Viper, something only 3 people in the world know about. One of them is dead, one is you, and the other... Colonel Mitchell, Marcus finished. General Mitchell now, Agent Peterson said. She's the one who sent us to find you. Marcus stared at the tablet screen, seeing the compound where 6 American warriors were being held because of something he'd done 15 years ago in another desert, in another lifetime. The weight of old choices pressed down on him like a physical force. These SEALs? He said quietly. They have families? All of them, Agent Collins confirmed. Kids, wives, parents who are praying their sons and husbands come home. Marcus thought about the men who hadn't come home from his last mission. About the families who had received folded flags and carefully worded letters that revealed nothing about what their loved ones had really died for. About the promises he'd made to himself in the aftermath, promises about never again being responsible for putting good people in harm's way. But he also thought about 6 American warriors, probably scared but still defiant, trusting that their country would move heaven and earth to bring them home. About the families counting down the hours, watching the news, hoping for a miracle. I need to think about this, Marcus said. Agent Peterson nodded. We understand. But Mr. Rodriguez, time is not on our side. These people, they've given us 72 hours to produce what they want, or they start executing the hostages. As the agents prepared to leave, Agent Collins handed him a secure phone. General Mitchell wants to speak with you personally, when you're ready. After they drove away, Marcus stood alone in his shop, surrounded by the tools and projects that defined his simple life. The phone felt heavy in his hand, loaded with the weight of old loyalties and new responsibilities. He thought about Tommy Brennan's sneering face, about the way the Tuesday morning crowd treated him like he was worthless, invisible, broken. If only they knew that the grease-stained mechanic they mocked had once been one of the most decorated soldiers in Army Special Operations. That the man they dismissed as a loser had received commendations from generals and thanks from presidents. That the quiet exile changing their oil had once changed the course of international conflicts. But those were secrets he buried for good reason. That life had cost him everything that mattered, had turned him into someone he didn't recognize. The question now was whether those old skills, that old knowledge, could be used to save lives instead of taking them. As the sun began to set over Millfield, Texas, Marcus Rodriguez stood at the crossroads between the man he had been and the man he had tried to become, holding a phone that could summon him back to a world he'd sworn never to return to. The choice before him would test everything he believed about duty, sacrifice, and redemption. And somewhere in a compound in the Syrian desert, 6 American heroes were counting on someone, anyone, to care enough to bring them home. The secure phone rang at 3 in the morning, cutting through the silence of Marcus's small apartment above the shop. He'd been awake anyway, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with demons that had names and faces, and families who deserved better than what he'd given them 15 years ago. The red numbers on his alarm clock glowed like angry eyes in the darkness. "Hello, Marcus." The voice was older now, touched with the weight of years and responsibility, but still unmistakably Sarah Mitchell. She'd been Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell when he'd last heard that voice, giving him orders that would change everything. "General," he said simply, "I heard you've become quite the mechanic. Mrs. Henderson speaks very highly of your work." Despite everything, Marcus smiled slightly. "You've been checking up on me. For 15 years. Did you really think I'd let one of my best soldiers disappear completely?" There was warmth in her voice, but also urgency. "Marcus, I need your help." "I figured. Your agents painted quite a picture. It's worse than they told you." Sarah's voice grew heavier. "The SEAL team leader, Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, he's only 28. His daughter just turned 6 months old. His wife Emma is barely holding it together, and the media is starting to sniff around the story." Marcus closed his eyes. "Don't do that, Sarah. Don't make it personal." "It already is personal. These men volunteered for this mission because I assured them the intelligence was solid. I told them the source was unimpeachable. That source was you, Marcus. The work you did on Desert Viper." The operation came flooding back in vivid detail. The months of preparation, the careful cultivation of assets, the delicate balance of trust and deception that had allowed them to map out an entire terrorist network. It had been his finest work, the kind of intelligence gathering that saved thousands of lives by preventing attacks that never happened. "The cache," Marcus said quietly. "They want the location of the weapons cache. The one that was never officially found," Sarah confirmed. "The one that only you, me, and David Chen knew about." David Chen. Marcus hadn't thought about his old partner in years, had tried not to think about him. Chen had been brilliant, fearless, and completely dedicated to the mission. He'd also been reckless in ways that eventually caught up with him. How did David die? Car accident in Bangkok 3 years ago. But Marcus, his laptop was stolen from the scene. We always assumed it was random, but now you think someone's been sitting on that intelligence for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to use it. The timing is too convenient. These hostage takers, they know details about Desert Viper that were never in any official report. They know about the secondary extraction route, about the safe house in Aleppo, about the asset we called Nightingale. Marcus felt ice forming in his veins. Nightingale had been their most valuable source, a woman who had risked everything to feed them information about terrorist movements and weapons shipments. If her identity had been compromised, is she alive? We don't know. Communications went dark 2 months ago. We hoped she'd just gone underground, but if these people have Chen's files, they could have rolled up the entire network. Marcus sat up in bed, his mind already shifting into operational mode despite himself. How many people are at risk?
Dozens.
Assets, their families, contacts, people who trusted us to protect them. Sarah paused. But right now, my immediate concern is 6 American warriors who are going to start dying in 68 hours unless we give these bastards what they want. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking down at his quiet shop. A streetlight illuminated the sign he'd painted himself. Rodriguez Auto Repair, honest work, fair prices. It seemed like a relic from someone else's life. What exactly are you asking me to do, Sarah?
The weapons cache from Desert Viper, we both know it was never just weapons.
The prototype guidance systems, the chemical precursors, the biological samples. That cache represented years of accumulated terrorist resources. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could arm a dozen terrorist cells for years to come. Or worse. Some of those biological samples, the ones we took from the Syrian lab, they were smallpox variants that don't exist in nature. In the wrong hands, they could start a pandemic that makes COVID look like a common cold. Marcus felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Give the terrorists what they wanted, and potentially arm them with weapons of mass destruction. Refuse and watch 6 good men die for the classified knowledge he carried in his head. There has to be another way.
If there is, we haven't found it.
The compound where they're holding the SEALs is a fortress. Satellite surveillance shows at least 40 armed guards, multiple defensive positions, underground bunkers. A direct assault would be suicide. And these people are smart enough to start executing hostages the moment they detect any kind of rescue operation. Marcus walked to his dresser and opened the bottom drawer, pushing aside old t-shirts to reveal a small metal box. Inside were the only mementos he'd kept from his old life. A faded photograph of his unit, a few medals he'd never officially received, and a letter from the family of a soldier who hadn't come home from Desert Viper. "Marcus, are you still there?"
Yeah, I'm here. He picked up the photograph, studying the faces of men who had trusted him with their lives.
"Sarah, if I do this, if I come back to help, there are conditions. Name them. I go in personally. Not to negotiate, not to hand over intelligence from a safe distance. I go in to get those SEALs out. Marcus, you've been out of the game for 15 years. These people are professionals, and you're not exactly in fighting shape anymore."
"I'm still in fighting shape."
It was true. He might be older, might carry more emotional scars than physical ones, but he'd never stop maintaining his body like it was a weapon. Old habits died hard. Besides, you need someone who knows the location of that cache, and I'm not putting that information on any communication channel, no matter how secure you think it is. Even if I agreed to that, and I'm not saying I am, how would you get close enough? They're not exactly accepting visitors. Marcus looked at the photograph again, at the faces of the dead, then at his reflection in the window. These hostage takers, they've been planning this for years. They know about Desert Viper, about the assets we ran, about operations that were buried so deep they don't appear in any database. That means they have someone feeding them information from inside. That's impossible. The number of people with access to that level of classified material is very small, which makes it easier to narrow down. Marcus set the photograph aside and pulled on the shirt. "Sarah, I'm coming to Washington. We need to talk face to face." "Marcus, what aren't you telling me?" "The biological samples from Desert Viper, the ones in the cache. We both know what was really in there." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "The enhanced interrogation serum. The one that was supposed to be destroyed. The one that Chen insisted we preserve for future study. The one that could break any trained operative in minutes, make them reveal everything they know." Marcus felt the old anger rising, the fury at choices that had seemed reasonable at the time but had haunted him ever since. If that gets out, if it gets reverse engineered, every intelligence service in the world becomes obsolete overnight. No secret is safe. Jesus, Marcus.
"Why didn't you destroy it?" "Because you ordered me not to. Because Chen convinced us it could be studied safely, used to develop countermeasures."
The memories were flooding back now. The arguments, the compromises, the decisions that had seemed so clear 15 years ago.
Because we were young and stupid and thought we could control forces we barely understood. And now? Now we clean up our mess. Marcus pulled on his boots. The same steel-toed work boots he wore every day. But suddenly they felt different, like they were carrying him towards something he'd been avoiding for too long. "I'll be in Washington by morning." After ending the call, Marcus spent an hour walking through his shop, touching the tools and equipment that had become his identity. Tomorrow he would lock the door and become someone else again. Someone he'd tried very hard to forget. But first, he had one more call to make. He dialed Mrs. Henderson's number, knowing she'd be awake. She never slept well anymore, not since her husband died and left her alone with bills and worries and a 20-year-old Honda that was all that stood between her and unemployment. "Marcus, is everything all right?" "It's so late. Mrs. Henderson, I need to go out of town for a while. Family emergency. But I've arranged for Tom Sullivan over at Sullivan's Garage to handle any repairs you might need. He's good people, and I've already talked to him about your situation." "Oh my goodness, is everything all right with your family?" Family. Marcus almost laughed at the irony. His only family now was a brotherhood of warriors scattered across the globe, some living, some dead, all bound together by shared secrets and necessary sins. "It will be," he said. "Mrs. Henderson, I want you to know, you've been the best customer a man could ask for. You reminded me that honest work has value. Marcus, you're scaring me. This sounds like goodbye." "Just in case," he said softly, "take care of yourself." The next morning, Marcus loaded a small duffel bag into his pickup truck and drove away from Millfield, Texas, leaving behind the life he'd built from the ashes of the man he used to be. In his rearview mirror, he could see the smoke rising from the coffee shop where Tommy Brennan and his crew would gather later that morning, probably wondering where the grease-stained mechanic had disappeared to. They would never know that the man they'd spent years mocking was about to undertake a mission that would determine the fate of 6 American heroes and potentially prevent a biological weapon from falling into terrorist hands. They would never know that the quiet, humble mechanic they dismissed as worthless was one of the most decorated soldiers in the history of Army Special Operations. But that was fine with Marcus. He'd never done this work for recognition or respect. He'd done it because sometimes the world needed people who were willing to carry impossible burdens and make unthinkable sacrifices. As he drove through the early morning darkness toward Washington, D.C., Marcus Rodriguez began the mental process of becoming Staff Sergeant Marcus Tank Rodriguez again. He reviewed everything he knew about the Syrian compound, about the weapons cache that had haunted his dreams for 15 years, about the biological nightmare that could not be allowed to escape. Most importantly, he thought about 6 young warriors who were depending on their country to bring them home. Warriors who had volunteered for the most dangerous duty their nation could ask of them, who had walked into hell trusting that someone, somewhere, would have their backs when everything went wrong. Marcus had let good men down before. He carried their names and faces with him every day, carved into his soul like scars that would never fully heal. But this time would be different. This time he would use everything he'd learned, everything he'd become, to make sure that no more American families received folded flags and empty promises. The highway stretched ahead of him like a bridge between 2 worlds, between the simple mechanic and the complex warrior, between the past he'd tried to escape and the future he was duty-bound to face. Behind him, the lights of Millfield faded into memory. Ahead of him lay the most dangerous mission of his life, one that would test not just his skills and courage, but his capacity for redemption. As dawn broke over the Texas plains, Marcus Rodriguez drove toward his destiny, carrying with him the hopes of 6 captured warriors and the weight of secrets that could reshape the balance of global power. The grease-stained mechanic was gone. In his place sat a man who had once been the best at what he did, and who was about to find out if 15 years of exile had dulled his edge or sharpened his resolve. The war room in the Pentagon was exactly as Marcus remembered it, sterile, windowless, filled with the tension that came from making decisions that would echo across generations. General Sarah Mitchell looked older now, her brown hair streaked with silver, and her face carrying the weight of command. But her eyes still held the same fierce intelligence that had made her the best operational commander he'd ever served under. "Marcus?" she said as he entered, flanked by Agent Peterson and Agent Collins. "You look good. Clean living agrees with you." 15 years of oil changes and tire rotations, he replied, taking in the room's occupants. Beside Sarah, there were 2 men in Navy dress uniforms, Admiral Harrison, whom Marcus recognized from news coverage, and a younger officer he didn't know. At the far end of the table sat a woman in civilian clothes whose bearing screamed intelligence analyst. "This is Dr. Mudafas, Rebecca Chen," Sarah said, following his gaze. David's sister. The family resemblance was unmistakable, and Marcus felt the familiar punch of guilt in his chest. David Chen had been more than a partner. He'd been a friend, someone Marcus had trusted with his life on multiple occasions. The fact that David's intelligence had been stolen and used against American forces felt like a personal betrayal of that trust. "Dr. Chen," Marcus said quietly, "I'm sorry about David. He was one of the best." "He spoke of you often," she replied, her voice carefully controlled. "Said you were the only operator he'd ever worked with who understood that intelligence was about people, not just information." Admiral Harrison cleared his throat impatiently. "We don't have time for reminiscences. Rodriguez, we've got 48 hours before these terrorists start executing American servicemen. What can you tell us about this weapons cache?" Marcus remained standing, studying the satellite photos spread across the table. The compound where the SEALs were being held looked like a fortress. High walls, multiple guard towers, underground bunkers that could shelter the hostage-takers from airstrikes. "Before I say anything about the cache, I need to know who else has been briefed on this operation." "That's classified information," Admiral Harrison said curtly. "Sir, with respect, someone with access to classified Desert Viper files orchestrated this trap. Those SEALs walked into an ambush that was 15 years in the making. Until we identify the leak, every piece of information we share is potentially compromised." Sarah leaned forward. "Marcus is right. We've been operating under the assumption that David's laptop contained everything these terrorists needed, but the intelligence they're displaying suggests ongoing access to current operational data." Dr. Chen pulled out a tablet and swiped through several documents. "I've been analyzing the demands they've made, cross-referencing them with my brother's known research projects. There are details here that David never had access to. Specific chemical compositions, updated satellite imagery, current safehouse locations." So we have a mole, the young Navy officer said. Marcus caught the name tape. Lieutenant Commander Brooks. How do we flush them out? We don't, Marcus said. We use them. All eyes turned to him. Marcus moved to the satellite photos, pointing to specific features of the compound. This fortress, it's designed to keep people out, but it's also designed to keep people in. Once you're inside those walls, there are only two ways out, through the main gate or in a body bag. You're suggesting infiltration, Sarah said slowly. But, Marcus, you've been out of the field for 15 years. These people are expecting deception. They'll be watching for any sign that we're not negotiating in good faith. That's exactly why it has to be me. Marcus pulled out a chair and finally sat down. His weathered hands spread flat on the polished table. I'm the only person alive who knows the exact location of the cache, the specific inventory, and the security measures David and I put in place. These terrorists can't verify what I'm telling them without actually going to the site. Admiral Harrison frowned. What are you proposing? I go in as the negotiator, offer to personally guide them to the cache in exchange for the SEALs. Once I'm inside their perimeter, once I've identified their leadership structure and defensive positions, I take them down from the inside. That's suicide, Doctor, Chen said flatly. You'd be one man against 40 armed terrorists in a fortified position. Marcus looked at her steadily. Your brother and I once infiltrated a compound twice this size with nothing but hand weapons and determination. The difference between then and now is that I have 15 years of experience understanding what really matters, which is getting our people home alive. Marcus turned back to the satellite photos. These terrorists, they're not ideological fanatics. They're businessmen. They want that cash because they can sell it to the highest bidder, not because they want to personally deploy biological weapons. That gives us leverage. Sarah studied his face intently. What kind of leverage? The cash isn't just sitting in a cave somewhere waiting to be picked up. David and I built in multiple security layers. Biometric locks, chemical fail-safes, proximity sensors that would destroy everything if tampered with incorrectly. Without the proper procedures, anyone trying to access it would end up with a crater instead of a weapons depot. Lieutenant Commander Brooks leaned forward. So you're saying the cache is essentially worthless without your cooperation? But accessing it safely requires specific knowledge that only I possess. Knowledge that can't be extracted through torture or coercion because it includes real-time decision-making based on environmental conditions that won't exist until someone's actually there. Dr. Chen was typing rapidly on her tablet. That's consistent with my brother's notes. He mentioned something called dynamic access protocols, but never explained what that meant. It means that even if I wanted to write down everything these people need to know, I couldn't. The final sequence requires reading chemical indicators, atmospheric measurements, and structural assessments that can only be made on-site. Marcus smiled grimly. David was paranoid about this stuff falling into the wrong hands. He built the security system assuming that someone would eventually try to force us to give up the location. Admiral Harrison looked skeptical. And you think these terrorists will just accept your word for all this? They don't have a choice. They've committed to a plan that requires them to obtain something only I can provide. The moment they start executing hostages, they lose their only bargaining chip. Marcus pointed to the compound's main building. They need me alive and cooperative, which means they need to keep the SEALs alive as leverage. That gives me room to operate. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the photos and Marcus's face in equal measure. Finally, she spoke. What do you need? First, I need the location of every American asset currently operating within 200 miles of that compound. When this goes sideways, and it will go sideways, I need extraction options that don't rely on ground vehicles or helicopters that can be shot down. That's a tall order, Lieutenant Commander Brooks said. Most of our assets in that region are deep cover. Exposing them could compromise years of intelligence gathering. 6 American warriors are going to die in 2 days, unless we do something, Marcus said quietly. I understand the value of long-term intelligence operations, but sometimes you have to choose between protecting sources and saving lives. Dr. Chen looked up from her tablet. There might be another way. My brother's research included contingency plans for scenarios exactly like this. What if we could convince these terrorists that the cache location has been compromised, that they need to move the hostages to a secondary site where we can intercept them?
How would we do that? Sarah asked. By feeding our mole false information? Marcus said, immediately understanding where Dr. Kidd.
Chen was going. We let them think we've discovered additional intelligence that makes the current exchange dangerous for both sides. Admiral Harrison frowned.
That assumes we can identify the mole.
We don't need to identify them specifically, Marcus explained. We just need to control the information flow. Dr. Chen, how many people know about your brother's contingency plans? David was secretive about his research, especially the operational details. Perfect. We craft a story about a second cache, one that contains information about ongoing terrorist networks. We make it seem like retrieving the biological weapons would expose the hostage takers to retaliation from competitors. Then we watch to see who passes that information along. Sarah nodded slowly. And when they move the hostages to what they think is a safer location, we're waiting for them, Marcus finished. But it has to be convincing. These people are professionals. They won't bite on amateur disinformation. Dr. Chen was already making notes. I can create documentation that looks like it came from David's files, reference points to real operations, enough authentic detail to pass scrutiny. How long do you need? Admiral Harrison asked. 6 hours to create the documentation. Another 6 to plant it where our mole will find it, Doctor. Chen looked at Marcus. But this only works if they believe you're genuinely willing to trade the cache location for the hostages. Are you prepared to actually go through with it if the disinformation doesn't work? Marcus thought about 6 young warriors sitting in a Syrian prison, wondering if their country was coming for them. He thought about their families, watching the news and praying for miracles. He thought about the promises he'd made to himself 15 years ago, about never again letting good people pay for his mistakes. Yes, he said simply. If it comes to that, I'll trade the cash for their lives, even if it means arming terrorists with biological weapons, Admiral Harrison demanded. Even then, because those 6 men volunteered to serve their country, and their country doesn't abandon its warriors. Ever. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of helicopter rotors on the Pentagon landing pad. Marcus could see the calculation running behind everyone's eyes, the weight of 6 lives against the potential death toll of biological weapons in terrorist hands. There's something else, Dr. Chen said quietly. Something I haven't told you about my brother's files. All eyes turned to her. She took a deep breath before continuing. The cache doesn't exist anymore. David destroyed it 3 years ago, after he realized his research was being monitored. The biological samples, the prototype weapons, all of it was incinerated at a facility in Nevada. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Then what the hell are we negotiating for? Admiral Harrison demanded. Documentation, research data, formulas and procedures that could be used to recreate everything we destroyed. Dr. Chen's voice was steady, but Marcus could see the pain in her eyes. David couldn't bring himself to delete the intellectual work, even after he destroyed the physical materials. He convinced himself that the information might be needed someday to develop countermeasures. So the cache these people are after, Sarah said slowly, is actually David's research files, which are stored on encrypted servers that require biometric authentication to access. Dr. Chen continued, David's biometrics specifically. But he programmed in a backup protocol, my biometrics, Marcus realized.
From our joint operations.
Exactly. You're not just the only person who knows where the cache is supposed to be.
You're the only person who can actually access what these terrorists really want. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Potomac River in the distance. 15 years ago, he'd helped create a nightmare scenario, and now that nightmare was demanding 6 American lives as payment for information that could spawn 1,000 new nightmares. Dr. Chen, he said without turning around. Those servers, do they have remote access capability? Yes, but the biometric scanners require physical presence. The system was designed to prevent exactly the kind of remote access that might compromise security. Marcus turned back to the room. Then we stick with the original plan, but with modifications. I go in as the primary negotiator, but instead of leading them to a non-existent cache, I give them access to the servers. Once they realize the scope of what they're actually getting, they'll want to verify the data before releasing the hostages. That gives us a window, Sarah said, understanding immediately. While they're distracted by the intelligence windfall, we move on the compound. It's still incredibly risky, Admiral Harrison pointed out. You'd be inside enemy territory with no backup, relying on split-second timing. Marcus smiled, for the first time since entering the room. Admiral, 15 years ago I was a lot younger and a lot more reckless. Today, I'm older, more careful, and I understand exactly what's at stake. Those 6 SEALs aren't just American servicemen. They're someone's sons, someone's husbands, someone's fathers. They deserve the same dedication and sacrifice that we'd want if it were our family members trapped in that compound. He moved back to the table, placing his hands flat on the satellite photos. Besides, I've got something I didn't have 15 years ago. What's that? Sarah asked. Nothing left to lose. And that, General, makes a man very dangerous indeed. As the planning session continued into the night, Marcus felt the familiar transformation beginning. The grease-stained mechanic who had endured years of small-town mockery was fading away, replaced by the warrior who had once been feared by America's enemies and respected by its allies. Tomorrow, he would become Tank Rodriguez again. Not the tank that Tommy Brennan and his crew had dismissed, but the tank whose legend was whispered in military circles around the world. Somewhere in a compound in the Syrian desert, 6 American heroes were counting on him to bring them home. And for the first time in 15 years, Marcus Rodriguez felt worthy of that trust. The grease-stained mechanic they had ridiculed was about to remind the world what real courage looked like. And when this was over, when the hostages were safe and the terrorists neutralized, maybe the people of Millfield, Texas would finally understand that they had been living among a legend. But that recognition would come later. Right now there was work to do, warriors to save, and a promise to keep. Marcus Rodriguez was going back to war one last time, and this time he was going to win.